I'm not Bruce Lee, I apologize. I'm extremely delighted that we're able to bring Professor Jerome Silbergeld here tonight. He is here as he's giving the keynote address for the BC China Scholars Forum, which we've held at the Institute of Asian Research over the last 2 days. He is here thanks to a very generous donation from the Rosalie Strong Family Foundation. And also, we are very grateful to the Canadian Society for Asian Arts, Asian Illuminations lecture series, of which this is also part, so it's a kind of double whammy. Professor Silbergeld, as you all know, since you've come here tonight, is an extremely distinguished professor of Chinese art history and scholar of art history. He is also known equally well for his work on Chinese film. He is P.Y. and Kim Mei Tang Professor of Chinese Art History and Director of the Tang Center for East Asian Art at Princeton University. But I think that we could all claim him as a West Coaster because he spent 25 years at the University of Washington. And during the conversations that I've had with him over the last couple of days, he keeps on saying "we" when he talks about Seattle. So I don't think you've entirely left somehow. But we're delighted to have you back. Even though we're not Seattle, but we're right next door. Tonight, Jerome will be speaking on a topic that fits in with the general theme of the BC China Scholars Forum this year was moving words, moving images. Jerome will be talking on what is the Chinese motion in Chinese motion pictures. And I just wanted to say one more thing. I teach Chinese film, and the Jerome's book, China into Film, is the one that my students and I both love equally. It's the one we always go back to, and it's because there is this beautiful sensibility talking about the ways in which Chinese art and traditional culture intersect with film, Chinese film. And I think that's probably what we're going to hear tonight. So thank you very much. I'm looking forward to it. Just done.
We hear this. More people coming in still. Let me thank you all for coming, and let me especially thank Allison for having me. The West Coast still feels like home to me, and it's always a great pleasure to come back. This was the city around the corner from us, and I was involved in your downtown Chinese garden down on Pender Street from long ago, and it's still the finest of its kind, like so many other things up here. Just to wander through this museum is always an extraordinary treat. When Allison invited me to contribute a talk to this Chinese Scholars Forum on the topic that she just read to you, moving words, moving images, I know that these topics are picked for their vagueness, so you can spread as broad a tent and get as many scholars into that tent as you possibly can. But I determined to take her literally. And so I know that moving, whatever else it means, can mean anything from physical motion to emotionally moving, but I decided to talk about the one visual arts medium distinguished primarily by a kind of illusion, at least, of physical motion, and that is the moving pictures, which I have gotten attached to in the last maybe 15 years, never having taken a course on cinema and never having heard a lecture on Chinese cinema before I decided to take it over for my own. As someone who regularly teaches now, maybe preaches, and publishes on the subject of Chinese cinema, and unfortunately, I think still the only China art historian coming out of that discipline who does so. I hope that won't be true for long. I realize that the status of Chinese cinema as a visual art remains problematic. And so I shape my topic this evening around the comparison between Chinese cinema and other pictorial arts, and especially Chinese painting, calligraphy, and still photography. In part, this comparison turns on two issues. First, movement and rates of motion, and second, the question of what, if anything, constitutes the Chinese motion in the visual arts as a measure of the Chineseness of style. Drawing relationships between different media has a long and respected history in China. The 9th century painting historian Zhang Yenyuan noted that Zhang Xu, a century earlier, was inspired in his calligraphy by the sword dance of Lady Gongsun, and that the poet Du Fu, in turn, was inspired to commemorate that relationship in verse. Zhang also noted that the great painter Wu Daozi said that General Peimin's, at the sight of such vigor as that of General Peimin's swordsmanship, this ought to help me wield my brush. And he claimed that Wu Daozi's wielding of the brush was more advanced after watching General Pei's swordsmanship. What is the common denominator between brushwork and swordsmanship? Well, obviously it is dynamic motion. The earliest major treatise on Chinese calligraphy, attributed to Madame Wei Shuo of the 4th century, but probably actually done about 3 centuries later, was entitled the Bi Zhen Tu, or the Battle Formation of the Brush. Certainly a dynamic conception of brushwork, and it provided dynamic characterizations of the 8 different types of brushstroke, with phrases like, fired from a 3,000-pound crossbow, and like a stone falling from a high peak, bouncing and crashing about to shatter. Now, Chinese calligraphic works aren't the oldest Chinese motion pictures, not because they aren't in motion, but because they aren't pictures. So what then about pictures? In our own time, movement through a painted Chinese hand scroll has been compared many times over to the motion pictures. In his introduction to the Chinese art of landscape painting, Michael Sullivan likened the unfolding events in Zhang Ziduan's 11th or 12th century hand scroll, the Qingming Festival Scroll, to the time sequencing of cinema. The painter, he wrote, takes us on a leisurely walk by the riverside, over the bridge, through the city gate, and into the busy streets, as though he were tracking with a movie camera. That was written in 1979, and there may have been a few earlier such references, but not until filmmaking had gained sufficient cultural status and crossed a threshold of artistic recognition would comparison of the elite art of Chinese painting to the popular medium of cinema have been deemed a suitable means for encouraging readers' appreciation of Chinese painting and not embarrassingly déclassé. We should not be surprised, however, that more detailed analyses of Western art developments in a cinematic framework had already occurred by this time. The camera, wrote Wiley Cypher in 1960, used with artistic consciousness, became the cinema, and revised the stylizations of the daguerreotype into the multidimensional art that is deeply congenial to Cubist painting. By its revolution in thought and method of representing the world, Cubism created a cinematic style. Marcel Duchamp's pioneering nude descending a staircase illustrates the point: painting's desire to move. Cypher formulates this not in terms of style, but of technology, implicitly recognizing motion pictures as a series of rapidly projected still photographs. As he put it, an artistic technique of presenting things as they exist in time by means of a composite perspective. Given Cypher's careful qualification of the term cinema, which incorporates the Greek word for motion, and put on guard by the specificity of Cypher's comparison, one might wonder about the aptness, and perhaps worry about the ease of characterizing a 1,000-year-old Chinese painting like Zhang Zituan's in its nearly 2,000-year-old format, the Chinese hand scroll, as somehow being cinematic. True enough, the Chinese hand scroll's lack of singular viewpoint facilitates a continuously expanding compositional structure. And like commercial films, many hand scrolls begin and end with text, including a painting title and concluding colophons that parallel somewhat a movie's opening titles and concluding credits. And some scrolls even feature text interspersed with the images, like silent film intertitles. But unlike narrative cinema, the Qingming scroll includes no storyline by which to clearly identify its time, place, or purpose. Moreover, before the advent of modern museum display, the Chinese hand scroll was not fully stretched out for viewing, but unrolled a little bit at a time, like you see here. Viewed serially rather than continuously, and read more like a page book than a movie. The viewer, traditionally, was active and controlled the viewing, with abundant opportunity to examine carefully, contemplate slowly, and scroll back and forth. Whereas with film, the audience views at the mercy of the medium's own rate of movement. Thus, the two media have certain similarities, but also significant differences. And comparing them invites the question of why one should consider such a comparison at all. And what assumptions do we bring to the task? Most cinema, for example, is rooted in dramatic narrative, whether fictional or documentary, but the vast majority of extant Chinese painted scrolls are landscapes or figures from a period after which narrative painting had gone into decline, and emotional drama was disfavored by Chinese patrons of high art. In Chinese painting, the rare examples of dramatic narrative tend to take place in a single scene, more like a still photograph than cinema. The movement takes place within the picture, not with the format itself. So what can most traditional paintings really tell us about the aesthetic origins of Chinese cinema, or about how to view Chinese cinema in a distinctively Chinese manner? Why, indeed, should we expect that the modern mass medium of Chinese cinema would owe anything to the elite medium, whether courtly or scholarly, of traditional Chinese painting? After all, even if we talk about art films or art house cinema, just how do we define that in a Chinese context, where art theaters have ever scarcely existed, and the intellectual elite has never controlled the patronage of cinema as they once did the patronage of painting? Does comparison of cinema to a more popular medium, like Buddhist painting or printmaking, or shadow puppets, or stage theater make better sense? The famous art historian Erwin Panofsky wrote of early Western cinema that instead of imitating a theatrical performance already endowed with a certain amount of motion, the earliest Western films added movement to works of art originally stationary. That is, they consciously imitated and tried to equal or even supplant painting. But in China, exactly the opposite was true. The first films were of staged operas, whose players moved, not the camera. And the medium was long known as yingxi, literally shadow theater, or perhaps better translated as image theater. In trying to understand the place of motion pictures in the world of the Chinese arts, would we do better to compare cinema only to modern and contemporary Chinese painting, or compare it to the more closely related medium of photography? Or should we focus instead of on format, then on more subtle aspects of style? If so, given the considerable influence of Western film on Chinese language film, must we also evaluate the possibility that Western art via its influence on Western film, has made a deeper impact on Chinese cinema than has Chinese art. Conversely, what should we make of those intentional stylistic markers by which certain Chinese filmmakers have determined to assure that an international audience recognizes and appreciates the Chineseness of their films? For example, the Chinese lanterns and weird theatrical masks in Zhang Yimou's Raise the Red Lantern, or Zhang's tropes on calligraphy in Hero. But then, what remains of any Chineseness when ethnic Chinese filmmakers produce films intended to be more or less Western, like The Ice Storm and Ride with the Devil, and others by Ang Lee, with American subjects serving as analogs to modernization in Taiwan family life and to China's Civil War? Two films I highly recommend. We are told by one who should know that audiences know what to expect, and that is all they are prepared to believe in. That's the playwright Tom Stoppard in Rosencrantz and Guildenstern Are Dead. When David Bordwell writes a film as a language to be learned, referencing the so-called classical continuity system that was a lingua franca of film style for all the world's mass-market cinemas associated with Hollywood since the 1910s, his words, so that the film-literate audience does not duck at the sight of an oncoming train or over-empathize with their actors, and recognizes the dialogical intent of shot-counter-shot editing. Does that mean that for the Chinese audience, the new language of cinema, in succeeding the classical language of traditional painting, is really a discontinuity system? Or are there significant continuities between these two systems, with an infusion of Chinese visual traditions into Chinese cinema? And if so, then what should we make of those influential writings by Ray Chow and others, which in the extreme have treated the cinematic medium as profoundly alien to China and its culture, and which would render this kind of comparative inquiry entirely futile? Whether one welcomes the cultural diversification cinema has accompanied, or laments the loss of national essence it has contributed to, I think that cinema has become and been a part of Chinese culture for far too long now to be regarded as inherently and forever foreign. Perhaps Chinese filmmakers bring their own culture to the medium, but just what culture is that? What characterizes and what constitutes the Chinese visual tradition? To return to Chinese paintings, an example by Ni Zan in both brushwork and composition is a study in calm stability, in remoteness and dispassion. A painting by Wu Jun becomes a fluid work in harmonic rhythm. But splashed ink paintings by Mu Qi and Yu Zhen are explosive. And a work by Xia Gui has all the rational, carefully calculated changes of pace found in good filmmaking, moving laterally, then pausing to recede into depth and detail, then moving again, moving into distance, rushing laterally before being suddenly halted, and so on and so forth, along the length of a scroll. The medium and format of all of these are Chinese, but what do these examples tell us about the style, temperament, and personality of Chinese painting in the singular, to which one might compare Chinese film, if also posed in the singular? The answer has to come as a warning against generalizations, and as an appreciation of types as stereotypes. To assert a commonality of Chinese painting, of all Chinese paintings, as shaped by their distinctive use of the Chinese brush and water-based pigments, is about as informative as asserting that all movies are alike for being made with the camera and projected on a flat, rectilinear screen. To an argument that the Chinese language itself, assuming that its various dialects truly constitute one language, which I tend to doubt, might somehow shape the distinctive cultural basis for a coherent Chinese mode of cinema, as suggested by the increasingly popular term Chinese language film, the actual Chinese-speaking audience offers resistance. The largest grossing Chinese language film of all time, Crouching Tiger, Hidden Dragon, was often ridiculed at home and did rather poorly. Ridiculed for its goofy admixture of accents spoken by its leading actors, Beijing Hua and Taiwanese, Cantonese and Malay English. So if, for the sake of argument, we disregard the enormous variation found in traditional Chinese painting, and also overlook the fact that by the time serious film production began in the late 1920s in China, much of the Chinese art world had already risen in rebellion against that tradition. There are a number of traditional features that have been said to embody a Chinese visuality, like flatness, the lack of plasticity and spatial depth. Arbitrary use of color, mostly in low saturated hues. Resistance to natural lighting. Incompletely defined settings. Suppression of dramatic impulse. Appreciation of emptiness and stillness. Minimal camera movement. Long takes, meaning long periods in which a single shot or continuing shot is being filmed. Long cuts, meaning long periods of time between the editor's cutting. And real-time action and dialogue. These are the characteristics that may appear, especially to a Western audience, to be particularly Chinese about Chinese language film. And so, in A Brighter Summer Day, 1991, by Yang Dechang, or Edward Yang, when he trains his camera on an open doorway without moving it for 30-40 seconds at a time, and lets the characters in the room beyond do the moving, back and forth, laterally in and out of view, sometimes speaking, sometimes silent, the flatness, the stillness, the diminution through distance and invisibility of emotional tension, all seem to convey an aura of authentic Chineseness. So too do similar scenes by Hou Xiaoxian, Tsai Ming Liang, and Ang Li, all from Taiwan, which by this standard of Chineseness produces the most Chinese of all Chinese language films. But by contrast, when John Woo, Tsui Hark, Jackie Chan, and other filmmakers, dating back to Bruce Lee and further to the flying martial arts scenes of King Hu, draw on the acrobatic traditions of Chinese theater, blend this with the dynamic choreography of Hollywood style, exaggerate it, and hand it back so as to change the fundamentals of action and fighting in recent American film, this represents either the least Chinese of Chinese language film in terms of style, or simply a different kind of Chinese cinema, colonial perhaps, with, in Bordwell's words, quote, a distinctive staccato rhythm amplified by color, music, editing, framing, and other film techniques. Former Harvard scholar Leo Lee, a film fan who loves only the early Chinese cinema, once proclaimed a link between the early establishment of a certain kind of Chinese camera work and Chinese life itself. The general visual style of most 40s films I have seen is subdued, he writes. Instead of trick camera work and flashy editing, they tend to rely on static long and medium shots. The close-ups are used relatively sparingly, and mostly to accentuate a high point in the character's interaction and an emotional peak. Rapid zooms and pans are seldom used. Dissolves, wipes, fade-ins, and fade-outs are generally employed to conform the changes of time and scene. The rhythm of this type of film is slow rather than frenzied, and perhaps parallels the rhythm of ordinary life, Chinese style, unquote. Beijing film scholar Hao Da-zheng references Zhang Zedon's Qingming scroll in writing about cinema, quote, "To enjoy a long tableau with small figures, one must shift one's line of sight left and right, or up and down, a necessary condition for the appreciation of Chinese visual representation. This reminds one of the tracking techniques used in films. Chinese moviegoers evidently take great pleasure in reenacting their experiences with painting." This moving focus, as George Rowley and later writers on Chinese painting called it, which has its counterpart in the cinematographer's tracking shot, might be regarded as essentially Chinese, as is the static long take, used to attain a sense of stillness in film. And yet, as James Udden has observed, one will be hard-pressed to find lateral tracking shots in any greater number in Chinese films than anywhere else. Udden goes on to note that, quote, "If finding an essential Chineseness is based on both a moving, tracking camera and a static, unmoving camera, then this is the classic scenario of some one thing explaining everything, while in reality explaining nothing." It is probably the long take and long editorial cuts, together with the medium to long range shot and lengthy pauses between conversations, slow down features all designed to establish a sense of real time in cinematic activity, that have been most widely regarded as essential Chinese characteristics in filmmaking. A recent study of Hollywood film structure confirms the speeding up of film activity over the decades through a reduction in average length of cuts, from about 13 seconds between cuts in 1945 to less than 7 seconds in 1965, to about 4 seconds average from 1985 to 2005. This plays to the audience's ever-shrinking attention span. But comparable figures for Taiwan's best-known artistic filmmakers indicate increasing times between cuts, progressing from 18 seconds per cut for Ho Xiaoxian's Summer at Grandpa's in 1984, 24 to 25 seconds per cut for Ho's Time to Live, A Time to Die, 1985, 32 to 35 seconds for his Dust in the Wind, 1986, 42 to 44 seconds for his City of Sadness, 1989, up to 84 seconds for his Puppet Master, 1993, 114 seconds for his Good Men, Good Women, which is my favorite of all, 1995, and 200 seconds for Ho's Flowers of Shanghai, 1998, which used only one take per scene. Yang Dechang's Confusion averaged 48 seconds, Tsai Ming Liang's Vive l'Amour, 36 seconds, and Tsai's film The Hole, 53 seconds. So the evidence is striking, but is it characteristic? David Bordwell writes, "Some researchers have claimed that the long take is a distinctive, long-standing tradition of Chinese cinema, but I cannot find the evidence for this. The 1930s and 1940s films I have checked yield a range of shot lengths about equal to that we find in other national cinemas of the sound era, including that of the United States. Moreover, Zhang Wen's films, for which I have done their statistics, In the Heat of the Sun, which averages only 6.28 seconds per cut, and Devil's on the Doorstep, which averages 4.22 seconds per cut, are probably typical of recent PRC cinema. So how is one to generalize? Reflecting on such data while writing of Ho Xiaoxian and the question of a Chinese style, James Udden concludes similarly. Unfortunately, he writes, neither Ho Xiaoxian nor the culture from which he arose are all that simple. There are other possible bases for linking cinema to traditional Chinese arts. The brush and ink linearity of Chinese painting, drawing subjects with incomplete form rather than with filled surfaces as in oil painting, and producing more of an idea than an illusion of material reality, has also been referenced in writings about Chinese cinema in relationship to the physical emptiness and inner truth of yellow earth, as has the swift execution and roughness of Chinese brushwork. The Chinese penchant for painting with colors more suitable to typological or decorative and expressive purposes than to realistic ends provides the basis for an examination by Jenny Kwok-Wah Lau of Chen Kai-ge's and Zhang Yimo's use of color in Yellow Earth and Judo. She says that the former film draws its contemplative effect and discursive strength from the coloration of Chinese landscape painting, while in the latter, bold splashes of red, yellow, or green that occupy major parts of shot compositions are likened to the spontaneity and accidentalism of Chinese splashed ink painting that generates, she says, a spirit of freedom or rebelliousness in the film. We could ignore the fact that historically Chinese splashed ink painting conspicuously eschewed the use of color. But once again, James Udden provides the skeptical response. It is one thing to say that Chinese film artists, past or present, have consciously tried to find ways of expressing indigenous art forms within the medium of film, which they clearly did with opera and later on with martial arts. It is a very different thing, he says, to argue that indigenous culture permeated the very fabric of these films' style, as if by a process of unseen osmosis. Once that is assumed, these writers can easily make anything seem Chinese, i.e., both a static and a moving camera, all the while quarantining those arguments from careful comparisons with non-Chinese examples, unquote. This is a subtle problem, in part because culture, in part, is osmotic. Cultural knowledge might well be acquired in less than a fully conscious manner. More important than what a filmmaker knows, though, is what his film says. And yet Chris Berry and Marianne Farquhar bolster their assertions about Chinese cinema's traditional roots with evidence of authorial intentionality, noting that Chen Kai-ge himself wrote that in Yellow Earth he was pursuing an inner truth based on outer reality, which he takes to be a Chinese trait, while Zhang Yimo is quoted as saying, "In traditional Chinese aesthetics, a painting's value lies in its idea, and this idea precedes the brush. I think cinematography is just the same," unquote. There are also professional links between cinema production and that of other visual media. It is perhaps not an uncommon career pattern that has led many Chinese filmmakers from studio arts into filmmaking. Jia Zhangke studied art, next door to a film theater, no less. Zhang Yimo studied painting and was a serious photographer before going into cinema. Tian Zhuangzhuang was a photographer. Lo Ye studied animation arts. Edward Yang designed comic books. Tian Zhuangzhuang recently described a Mongolian sunrise he filmed for his early film On the Hunting Ground in 1985, and how its beauty made his hair stand on end, exclaiming, "It was a scene right out of a painting. It was so gorgeous. And I remember thinking to myself, this is what film is all about," linking the two media. Again, the real issue here is perceptions, the filmmaker's own perceptions, accurate, credible, or otherwise, of tradition and Chineseness. I personally feel that Yellow Earth is a very Chinese film, says Chen Kai-ge, lest there be any doubt about that. What seems most clear in the case of the fifth-generation film movement, in its prime in the 1980s, was its intention to draw on Chinese tradition in its most characteristic forms, setting many of its narratives in the past as a politically secure means of commenting on the politically insecure present, and in doing so, drawing upon and updating China's traditional arts and culture. But that film generation holds no monopoly on the long-take ethos. More recently, Jia Zhangke, an arch representative of post-fifth generation film, rejects costume drama and historical allegory in favor of dealing with China's post-socialist here and now, in here and now ways. And yet he remains intensely interested in the loss of identity and the undermining of basic social values by China's headlong plunge into market capitalism and cultural assimilation. The minimalist settings, long takes, and long silences in his films, from Xiao Wu to Still Life, are nostalgic devices, reminiscent of the Yellow Earth film era, just as Yellow Earth was reminiscent of Republican-era films like The Goddess and Street Angel. One will not be surprised by Jia recalling that watching Yellow Earth when it first came out, quote, changed my life. It was at that moment that I decided I wanted to become a director, and my passion for film was born. When is tradition not just about the past? And when is landscape more than just a landscape? Yellow Earth begins with a lateral, slow pan of the barren, Lussic landscape of the film's title, conspicuously hand-scroll-like. And it ends with a vertical pan of the same site, the same landscape, top to bottom, 3 times over, as with a hanging scroll. It raises the question, as does the barren tree at the very outset of the Qingming scroll, set in that same Yellow Earth some 9 centuries earlier. After all the travelers have come and gone, and after all the governments and their ideological schemes are forgotten, will the landscape and the lives of those people it nourishes remain the same, essentially, unchangingly Chinese? When asked about the people, both literally and figuratively drowned by the massive landscape of this dry and barren Yellow Earth, Chen Kaige responded, "This is all connected to the Cultural Revolution. We all know that the Cultural Revolution was a fascist collective movement. I wanted to pose the question, can the individual survive amid the rushing, flood-like power of the collective, or will he be swept away and destroyed?" To draw upon another medium, traditional architecture, Zhang Yimo's cinematic reconstruction of Qin architecture is dazzling in the film Hero, and based on professional models of Qin and Han imperial halls. But these models in turn are based on the barest of data, mere foundational remains, whose sufficiency for such detailed reconstructions any architectural historian would treat with great skepticism. One wonders, can Zhang distinguish Qin architecture from Tang, 8 centuries apart? I tend to doubt it. In Judo and Raise the Red Lantern, historical architecture also plays a major role in portraying traditionalism, their courtyards giving form to the rigid traditions of patriarchal authoritarianism, set in the past but representing the years surrounding the Tiananmen disaster. That was right after June 4th, said Zhang Yimo of Red Lantern. And I don't know why, but against that particular historical backdrop, I suddenly found myself having all kinds of ideas about the inherent nature of the Chinese people. I shot the film very quickly, immediately after June 4th, so it is inundated with symbolism. Typically, just as these filmmakers intentionally took liberties with their temporal settings, their presentations of art, intentionally or otherwise, took considerable liberty with art historical chronology. Chiang Kai-shek's response to Tiananmen, his Farewell My Concubine, was a lament for the brutalization of culture by politics. In it, the theatrical arts may be taken as a trope for the art of cinema or any artistic medium manipulated by militarists and politicians. The critical scene in which the central figure, the young actor Zheng Jieyi, is ceremonially confirmed in his dedication to the theater and as a female impersonator, is accompanied by the hand scroll-like horizontal panning of his fellow students lined up side by side, alternating with the panning of an actual hand scroll, which you see below, illustrating the concubine's role he plays. But ironically, in this salute to tradition, the exegetic handling of the hand scroll, which is not actually there in the scene depicted, and the mixing in of extraneous sounds related to the storyline of the hand scroll, but not to the figures present in the story, are distinctively modernist in character, the most up-to-date importation at that time of Western filmmaking methods. Returning to the art of calligraphy, Yellow Earth begins with a historical introduction, a textual preamble, which is presented in late clerical script orthography of about the 4th century and seal script brushwork of a still earlier era. An appropriately slow-moving mode of brushwork that reinforces the theme of an unchanging China, and which is yet wholly anachronistic for the period, the 1930s, in which the film is set. Nearly 2 decades later, Zhang Yimou's Hero employs calligraphy as a major didactic vehicle, beginning with the film's title, boldly executed in blood-red characters. Again, well matched by way of style to the character of the film, but again anachronistic to the film's Qin Dynasty setting, in orthography and brush movement being no older typologically than the Tang Dynasty some 900 years hence. Throughout the film Hero, brushwork is equated with swordsmanship, as it was since ancient times, although one might argue that the martial arts style of the film has little to do with early Chinese martial arts. This equation is lodged in diegetic phrases that seem intended to civilize and to help justify the militant pursuit of national unity and social stability by the first emperor, and by China's present-day rulers as well. Both calligraphy and swordplay rely on one's strength and spirit, the emperor tells us, and legend said his skill as a swordsman was rooted in his calligraphy. How odd that the character for sword could be written in so many ways, the first emperor to be remarks, in a very old Chinese trope for social chaos. It makes the written language impossible to comprehend. Once I've conquered the 6 kingdoms and all of the northern tribes, I will eradicate this problem by mandating one style of writing. This highly derivative film is stylistically indebted less to any Chinese tradition than it is to Leni Riefenstahl's cinematically brilliant but morally toxic Triumph of the Will, set at the Nazi Party rallies in Nuremberg in 1934. Yet the architecture and costuming are steeped in the iconic black color of the Qin Dynasty, and Zhang claims that in both Hero and his House of the Flying Daggers, his own strong interest in color shaped the choice of historical setting, not the other way around. The story of Hero, he says, really could have been set in any dynasty, but I knew that I wanted to shoot a black imperial palace. The setting of Flying Daggers was supposedly shaped by Zhang's interest in Tang mural paintings at Dunhuang. One might think that cinema, as the art of our time, would direct some of its attention beyond the hand scroll or traditional architecture to the other arts of our own time. But there is less of this than one might expect. Only in a few films that I've seen? Is it modern art that provides the visual cues? And even this usually incorporates some secondary complaint, not about art itself, with an eye to the past instead, a lament for the disappearance of traditional values, or a complaint about the persistence of past vices, or both, as in Huang Jianxin's Black Canon incident. As for comparing film to film, cinema to photography, in the color film era, not many have resisted the use of color. But Zhang Wen's Devils on the Doorstep, set in the last months of the war against Japan, does this in pursuing the illusion of realism, of a documentary-like visual authenticity. It may seem ironic that eliminating much of the information normally brought to our eyes would seem more realistic, but many painters from the late Tang, the Sung, and afterwards once felt that way, eliminating the distraction of color in order to peer into a deeper inner reality that modern black and white photographers have often felt about in the same way. For their meticulous historical reconstruction, Zhang Wen and his distinguished cinematographer Gu Changwei directed their visual reference straight to the early technology of film itself. However, to obtain the look of documentary camera work, Devils had to do more than just eliminate color, achieving photographic intimacy, spontaneity in acting, accuracy in costuming, naturalistic lighting, and handheld camera movement were all essential to the realistic effect. Riding the rising tide in China of documentary photography and documentary film, director Li Yang made 3 documentary films before turning to documentary-like fiction. To convey a sense of authenticity in his film Blind Shaft, about corruption in China's mining industry, much of it filmed 700 feet underground in the narrow confines of a coal mine, and intentionally forcing its audience to see the film as if watching a documentary, Li established the following principles. Quote, "The shooting camera was always shoulder-mounted, so we could shoot at eye level, which provides a very objective perspective. I had already determined this stylistic approach even before we started shooting. It was to be, 1, no long shots, 2, constantly moving cameras, 3, no shots higher than eye level. I wanted to strip the film down to the simplest possible cinematic language. I tried to carry this same approach through with the color employed in the film. I stayed with simple pale colors in the coal mine areas, whereas in the city where there are many colors and which seems to be in disarray, I used many colors." It may seem peculiar that realism is affected in Zhang Wen's film Devils by black and white cinematography and in color in Li Yang's Blind Shaft. In Yang Dechang's film by a motionless camera taking distant shots, and in Blind Shaft by a constantly moving camera, often in close range and with a fast editing rhythm. But theirs are different realities. As Li Yang himself has said, realism does not necessarily mean shooting reality as it is. What's the point of art if all you want to do is capture pure reality? In making his film, Li became aware of the, quote, unimaginable surprises in China's ecologically rapacious mining industries. Almost 100% illegal operations, he claims, of its coal mines. The miners, he says, don't live in buildings. They just dig holes in the ground, build a makeshift shack on top, install a door, which is the type of dwelling you see in the first scene of my film. They're more like rat holes. The bedding that most of the coal miners sleep on is actually as dirty and black as the coal itself. And usually there is a shortage of water, at least clean water, in the mining areas. The water there has very high levels of coal and sulfur contamination, so the coal miners did not wash themselves very often. Critic Jonathan Noble equates the coal in this film with exploitation, writing that the sordidness of the mine shaft, highlighted in the scene in which the miners take a bath to clean the black dust from their weary bodies. Despite any similarities, the strategies of a filmmaker and those of a still photographer are as different as their media. Photographer Gung Yunxiang spent 7 seasons shooting in the remote coal mining district where Yunnan, Sichuan, and Guizhou provinces conjoin. The coal miners' bathing scene in Blind Shaft is not all that different from Gung Yunxiang's photograph, Miners at Wushang Mountain, both works from 2003. Surplus labor stripped down to bare bodies. Both Li and Gung are alert to the need to present a convincing product to their audience in order to deliver an effective reformist message. And yet Gung could hardly document high-level corruption and the lack of effective government regulation with single-frame photographs. Instead, he focused on the miners themselves and their hardships, in his own words, hoping to impress on his viewers the incomprehensibility of such conditions today. Gung emphasized, in contrast, the virtues of stylistic beauty, noting how greatly images used to present such horrible things are able to take on a formal, painterly, aesthetic appearance. And so that contrast between beauty and horror motivate his work. As a movie director, however, Li Yang felt obliged to establish an engaging narrative in order to develop a broader base of interest, introducing an elaborate crime plot with a Hitchcock-like twist at the end, via a pair of low-level grifters engaging with their own bosses in the corruption of the industry, implying that a failure to maintain high moral standards at the top, above ground in mining terms, has lowered the moral standards at the bottom of the shaft. Li Yang says, quote, "Many art house films are very slow, trying to fit a lot of ideas into their structure. I do not think that art house films have to be slow, because what happens is that they are often so slow that ordinary audiences just lose their patience. I kept thinking about what it is about Hollywood movies that allows them to conquer audiences around the world. Although you can say that a lot of Hollywood movies are shallow, it is undeniable that they also excel in several areas and are often incredible on the technical side. I decided that the film I was going to make had to have a fast rhythm, and I did not want to tell the audience too much." Whatever it is they share by way of purpose, Li's film and Gung's photographs did not share by way of reception. Gung says that his photographs had a positive impact on the audience wherever they were shown and were unanimously praised for the good photography. But Li's illegal film was and still remains barred from a commercial screening in China. Li's film was subjected to industrial and government reprisal, both threatened and actual. What one might expect is the reason for this contrast between media. That cinema is considered by government censors to be a more subversive medium than photography is not the reason offered by Li. As he relates about his arrival at one coal mine to shoot, "Because of my camera, people there took me for a journalist." He recalls, "They all had guns drawn, and I was scared. Pretty soon people from the Public Security Bureau showed up as well, and they were ready to arrest me. They could have just made up some excuse to arrest me, or even to kill me. They had thought that I was a journalist. Later on, I heard that less than half an hour after they had been notified of my presence, all the small coal mines in that entire county were suddenly shut down. Word had spread that a journalist, supposedly me, was sent by the central government to secretly investigate the mines." Li concludes that it would have been impossible and even dangerous to have undertaken the film's post-production in China. As seen in these examples, then, beyond the troubled question of a national style, what Chinese film really shares with the other Chinese visual arts is a body of cultural reference, of content and context, both historical and contemporary. Such references often explain the filmmaker's stylistic and thematic choices, and work best when specific, taking us beyond homogenizing generalizations about style. Frequently, these references are most powerful when left unspoken, as purely visual moments, iconography for the art historian. Sometimes that silence is meant to provide a modicum of maneuverability in the face of censorship by text-savvy, image-challenged censors. I have written about a number of iconographies in relation to particular films, drawing in a Panofskian way on traditional Chinese painting, printmaking, and architecture for comparison and confirmation. For example, the investment of mirrors with moral implication. The long and significant history of the broom as a symbol of spiritual and political purification. The anthropological authenticity of a jar-sinking ritual in Yellow Earth. The critical political implications of a solar eclipse in Red Sorghum. Coded landscape images of the trysting female and the historical link between female subordination and drowning. The demonization of women. The demonization of minorities and foreigners. How, in traditional terms, to read figural presentation in relation to influence and authority. The distinctive concepts of anthropomorphism and zoomorphism in relation to Chinese justice and punishment. The madman or fool is a visible symbol of enlightenment. The persistence of the pagoda's death imagery in contemporary Chinese architecture and cinema. The long-standing tradition of the image within an image is related to multiple personality. The moral implication of treetops. The multivalent symbolism of ox herding. And the grand tradition of allegory itself. Cinema is the visual art of our time, and thus the visual language of cinematic style needs to be considered in its own right. Immediately, the question arises as to what that language is, and whether Chinese language film has its own visual language, stylistic or iconographic, different from other film traditions. There is as yet no publication attempting to systematize Chinese cinema as a visual subject, like Rudolf Arnheim's Film as Art from 1932, or Bruce Kawen's How Movies Work from 1992. But more important than the comparativist issue of Chinese film's ethnic identity are the quality and particular visual qualities unique to each individual film as a creative work of art. As a Chinese art historian, my writings on cinema have primarily emphasized the visuality of the subject, their reference to visual history, and the rewards of intense visual scrutiny. But the subject of Chinese film as a visual art is vast and still largely unexplored. We need more art historical input. In the search for Chineseness, in the Chinese visual arts, of course there are modern artists who have sought this out for themselves. In the 1930s, photographers who meant their works to look like traditional paintings. and filmmakers today whose works are meant to look like photographs or traditional paintings. But this is stylistic stereotyping, and it presents a rather narrow view of Chinese stylistic traditions in a rather unprogressive light. I reject the notion that Chinese language film perpetuates a traditional Chinese visual style or partakes in a national style, not because I think there is no such style to partake in, but rather because there are too many such styles, too many different traditional styles, and too many different styles of film. Fast, slow, and everything in between, Chinese painters and Chinese cinema has it all. And yet there is a national culture and a national history, which is deeply embedded in Chinese film, and without a detailed knowledge of which the viewing audience cannot fully understand or fully appreciate Chinese cinema. Thank you.
Thank you very much. You've given us so much. So much to think about. First thing I thought about when you first began comparing Qingming Shanghe Tu to the narrative sequence in film, for example, coming from a background specializing more in poetry than in painting, the first thing I thought of was Su Dongpo's famous statement talking about the Tang Dynasty, the flourishing Tang Dynasty, mid-8th century. Wang Wei, who was both a painter and a poet, and he said, 诗中有画，画中有诗. There is painting in his poetry, and there is poetry in his painting. Narrative flow in itself is a very, very interesting form, a vehicle, if you will, for metaphorical comparison. And I'm thinking, for example, in Chinese calligraphy, I see realistic drama, traditional realistic drama, quite clearly kaishu, very with its regularity and standardization. More heavily romantic flow would be xingshu, which is somewhat cursive. A more abstract narrative flow would be caoshu, grass writing, which is quite clearly cursive. And who knows, maybe postmodern narrative flow would be guangcao, the stark raving grass or something like that. But that you've raised some interesting, to me, interesting parallels. I don't have to take responsibility for what I say because I've been retired for 3 years now, so just, take or leave what I say. I would like to hear, perhaps in a future lecture, I'd love to find ways of getting you back here again, to have you take, I don't know if you've looked at them or not, but the Baojuan, of which we have one of North America's leading experts here, just retired a few years ago, Odanian, where's Dan Overmeyer has done a lot of study, but the Baojuan have both narrative texts and paintings to illustrate that narrative for the purpose of illiterate readers. But you have both narrative language written out, and you have illustrations of the narrative in long sequences. I think that gives us something else to think about. And I was made to think when I saw, especially you left Gang Yunsheng's miners at Wumeng Mountain, that the bathing sequence there up for quite a while, and as I looked at it I was thinking, wow, that reminds me of some of the Buddhistic paintings this would be from even before the Tang and during the Tang Dynasty, of the horrors that await sinners in hell. And that there is a long tradition of that in Chinese painting. Anyway, those are just my irresponsible thoughts, but my main purpose here is to thank you on behalf of one of the co-sponsors, the Canadian Society for Asian Arts, of which I'm currently the president, and the other co-sponsors, the MOAT, the Museum of Anthropology, who are kind enough to provide the space for us, and of course the CCR, which, to tell you how long I've been around, to me that meant Creedence Clearwater Revival, but it's now the Center for Chinese Research. And I'm sure this is the highlight of what our visitors from not only the Greater Vancouver area, but from other places in BC will look back upon as a highlight. And I want to thank you very much for that. And am I correct, Margot, in that it would be appropriate for me to welcome everybody to stay around for a brief reception? We have some goodies. Oh, good. I just wanted to make sure because I hadn't seen them when I came in. Please stay around and have a chance to thank him yourself. So please join me in thanking Professor Silbergeld. Sure did.
Should we stop for any further questions or comments? If you are all thinking that hard and that eloquently, I don't need to say anything more. I've served my purpose. You certainly came up with some good thoughts and comments, but
If you would like to,
if anybody else wants to make a comment or raise a question, you can ask either of us. Xing?
But just to make some noise, and thank you for this wonderful lecture, Jerome. I'm really puzzled about this Chineseness. I've been struggling with this term for at least 15 years. And well, only 15 years. I'm really interested in the examples and the comparisons you have. And just mention a couple of them, I realized they're actually not so Chinese. For instance, this still not moving camera, that is from Japanese director Ozu. He's famous for not moving. And Hou Xiaoxian and what's his name? This crouching tiger, Liang, and this or Edward Yang. They really derive from there, and even that shot is from Ozu. Zhang Yimou made the film crew to walk up and down to make this little road in order to have this huge long shot, and that's one thing. I'm just trying to figure out what is this Chineseness. And second is this enlightenment, madman as enlightenment. That suddenly reminds me of Rain Man and Forrest Gump. They also somehow give us a sense, a notion. Is this really Chineseness? I really like what you said in the end. The Chinese culture and history embedded in Chinese cinema. Then we come back to the square one. What is the Chinese national culture? So I came to try to see what is Chineseness in this.
All I can say is I think it lives in particulars. And if you're Chinese and you know how to mine these things, you can make them speak. But the foreigner especially, and the person who isn't historically inclined, can only sort of grab at stereotypes. And as you say, this could be Mizoguchi, it could be Inagaki, it could be any Japanese filmmaker. Although you can find as many varieties of Japanese filmmaking as you could of any other. And my only caution is that we read these things, we present them to students, and the filmmakers participate in some cases in the process when they're really trying to become Chinese because they're really trying to appeal to an international audience, and therefore they tend to reaffirm the notion that this is what Chineseness is. And that becomes our view because we've seen it for ourselves in the movie theater. It must be true. And it partakes in that level of education or perhaps miseducation. But a real education is one that exists in the specifics, in the particulars, that knows its history, that knows its cultural events, that knows its poems, and draws on them. And avoids the broad sweeping generality for the nugget that you feel, oh, now that's Chinese, because it couldn't be anything else. It was Chinese. And I don't think, I think that we all run risks in teaching in teaching linear histories, in teaching the rapid sweep of a survey, in teaching the broad generalities, in moving from chapter to chapter as if life and time were divided up into chapters, and in teaching in a simple way. And I'm old enough now, I don't feel it, but I know I must look it, that it's time to sort of say, well, what are the few things that I really believe most? And this is what comes out in all of my writings. Doesn't matter what the subject matter is, whether it's 14th century Sung to Yuan painting, as you've seen. The one thing that I try to impress on my students, no matter what the subject is by no simplicities. Life, as you know, from the minute you get up in the morning is complicated. Lots of life, history, culture is not going to be any simpler than that. So teach complexity. Teach people how to think, accept, appreciate, deal with complexity. That's the most important thing we have. And time and again we see that simplicity is the stuff that suckers fall for and that brings down societies. We can't afford it. So that's my underlying sense of the whole matter. Don't do that to China. And don't do it to your own culture either, whether that's Chinese or Canadian or American. Recognize the complexities of the matter, first and foremost.
Any other questions or comments?
Good enough. We can go
If not,
to...
you have a chance to buttonhole him at our little reception outside.
Okay.
Please thank me once again, and thank you.
Thank you all once again. It's been a pleasure.